welcome to the final session of the Budapest Global Dialogue. My name is Lilla Kakuk. I work at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, and I will be the moderator of this session. As we are concluding our conference, the subtitle of the final panel could be Looking Back, Looking Ahead. We will begin our conversation with the opening remarks of Professor Sachs, who has only limited time with us. After his opening remarks, we will continue the conversation on the stage. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody, and Happy New Year to everybody in Budapest. And fortunately, I've just been able to confirm that we'll be coming to Budapest early in 2025, so I hope I see many of you in person at that time. This has been a terrible year from the point of view of geopolitics. It has been a terrible U.S. administration. I think the Biden administration has been about the worst of our modern times. It has been a terrible European Union Commission, I'm sorry to say. And we have the very high unpredictability looking forward. So we are with three major crisis zones in the world. There are many beyond that, but three that pit the major powers against each other. Of course, the war in Ukraine is a war between the United States and Russia. The war in the Middle East is a war of the US and Israel on much of the Arab world. And the tension in East Asia is a growing risk of conflict between the United States and China. In all three of these areas, diplomacy could have prevented the conflicts. Diplomacy is needed to end the conflicts. Whether we have diplomacy or not remains to be seen. In the case of the Ukraine war, this is a war of NATO enlargement, plain and simple. Prime Minister Orban and Prime Minister Fico are the only two leaders in Europe that understand this accurately. This is a war that was provoked by the United States, not by Russia. It was a long-term plan of the United States to expand NATO and with the specific objective of surrounding Russia in the Black Sea with NATO countries, with the idea that Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would all surround Russia's Black Sea fleet and basically render Russia a has-been on the world scene. And this was all spelled out very clearly by U.S. strategists in the 1990s, and it has played out since then. The war came because of this, and because the United States refused to recognize Russia's legitimate security interests of not having NATO on its borders, not being surrounded by NATO countries, especially since in 1990, the United States and Germany said in unequivocal terms that NATO would not enlarge 1 inch eastward, much less all the way to the Caucasus. So the U.S. caused this. It should not have overthrown Yanukovych in 2014. It should have negotiated with Russia in 2021. It should have allowed Ukraine to declare neutrality in 2022, but it did none of those things because the U.S. deep state is, to this day, intent on defeating Russia and expanding the U.S. Military power as far and wide as it wants. And this is, Biden has been part of that, and that's why he has been one of our worst presidents in modern history. The second crisis in the Middle East is a crisis that has come for a very basic, unworthy reason as well, which is that Israel conquered Palestinian land in 1967, and it decided to keep that land and to rule over the Palestinians in an apartheid state. And Netanyahu is very clear about this. Israel will never retreat from the Palestinian lands. If the Palestinians don't want to be ruled by Israel, they should leave. This is as simple as that. Netanyahu recognized 30 years ago that this would lead to resistance. This would lead to military resistance by Hamas and Hezbollah and others. And Netanyahu's strategy, spelled out already in 1996, is instead of fighting Hamas and Hezbollah, Israel should fight the countries that back Hamas and Hezbollah. And in 2001, a famous list of 7 countries was drawn up that the United States would overthrow in 5 years. And this list included Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. And interestingly, the United States has gone to war with 6 out of these 7 countries. The United States has backed Israel's war against Lebanon. The United States has been directly involved through the CIA in Syria since 2011. The United States invaded Iraq. The United States invaded Libya. The United States backed proxy fighters in Somalia and Sudan. And the one country that the United States has not directly attacked is Iran. But Netanyahu wants the U.S. to escalate to go to war with Iran as well. So I regard the Middle East wars, including the fall of Syria last week, as a plan that has been underway for 30 years to remake the Middle East in Israel's image and to have the United States carry the heavy lifting of that. The result is a disaster. It's basically the destruction of Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan, all of which remain battlefields until this day. And this was the plan. I mean, the plan was that these would be functioning US-backed states, but none of them is functional. And Syria is very unlikely to be functional as well. It's more likely to fall into civil war than to be a functional state. The third crisis is in East Asia. And this is America's struggle to remain the hegemonic power despite the rise of China. Now, it's impossible for the United States to be the hegemonic power of East Asia because China is larger and more powerful in East Asia. The United States is trying to harm China's economy through tariffs, through prohibitions of technology, through general info wars, through instructions to its companies not to invest in China, through formulating trade agreements that exclude China. And of course, the United States is trying to surround China with US military bases in Japan, in Korea, in Australia, and in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. This is a doomed course. China will not be contained. China will not succumb to US pressure. And if worse were to happen, the US and China will go to war, perhaps over Taiwan. This is US madness. The US cannot defeat China in a war in East Asia, of course not. But the war could either turn into a world war or an outright military defeat of the United States. I don't know which it would be, but it would be a complete disaster. So these are the main crisis zones in the world. As you hear, my own view is the United States is the faulty party in all 3 cases. basically reflecting the delusions of unipolarity or the delusions of hegemony, which I think is a kind of arrogance that is way past its time and is getting us into a lot of trouble. My own hope for 2025 is that the U.S. changes its foreign policy, that all three of these crises should be diffused straightforwardly. How could that happen? Three ways. First, the United States could stop NATO enlargement, and that would end the war in Ukraine. Second, the United States could back a state of Palestine, and that would end the war in the Middle East. Third, the United States could acknowledge that Taiwan is clearly a part of China, and the United States would stop sending armaments to Taiwan, and that would end the tensions with China. Do I count on any of this? Maybe Trump will end the war in Ukraine. I doubt that he will recognize the state of Palestine, and I doubt that he will tamp down tensions with China, though it is possible that he would do something more on that. He will launch a trade war with China for sure. Whether he launches a hot war or a rising escalation with China over Taiwan remains to be seen. So I can't give you a forecast because we're going to have one of the most unpredictable administrations in our history. I can only give you a prescription, and the prescription is peace, peace, and peace in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in East Asia by the United States changing its foreign policy approach and accepting the reality of multipolarity. The final thing I want to say is that European foreign policy is absolutely bizarre and dreadful. Europe mortgaged its future to NATO, which is completely unjustified and not in Europe's interest. Van der Leyen doesn't know whether she is an employee of the United States or actually the head of the European Union Commission. Kaja Kallas is as likely to create a war with Russia as she is to find a diplomatic way, because the rhetoric that comes out of the new High Representative for Europe is absolutely destabilizing. Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, is already showing completely adverse views that Europe now has to go to 3% of GDP, that it's all getting ready for war with Russia, for no reason, because what Europe needs to do is to understand collective security, that Russia has real security interests, that the United States is provocative and needs to stop provoking, and Europe's real solution, but maybe too late, never too late, Europe's real solution should be the OSCE, which is a body of 47 countries based on collective security, not on NATO, not on blocs, not on security for some at the expense of others, but on collective security. So these are the remarks that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insights, Professor, and thank you for taking the time to join us. We'll have a lot to reflect on, but we'll let you go. Thank you again, and have a pleasant day ahead. Gentlemen, I think that the professor mentioned many things that we want to discuss during the panel, and we will get to that. But first of all, I would like to start this conversation by asking for your own evaluation of 2024. We are in a lucky position of having a Chinese and American, Hungarian speakers on this panel. So three major powers are represented on this panel. I would like to ask you what you consider to be the biggest lesson or lessons of 2024 from an American, a European, and a Chinese point of view?
I think the biggest lesson in 2024 is that American political experts really don't know what they're talking about. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's just been so long that they call everything wrong. I mean, in 2016, that's forgivable. In 2020, they called it all wrong. And this time they said they've adjusted all the polling mechanism. They made adjustments. They said they have assigned different weights to everything. And still, they got it so completely wrong. So something is wrong in the American political expert class. That, I mean, America is an important country, of course, to all of us. So in order to understand the trajectory of the United States, I think we should probably come to Hungary more. And we can't be reading these American experts.
Well, first of all, apologies for my voice, but now that I've been pinned as American and Hungarian, and I'm supposed to somehow represent both positions, the game will be to decipher which clauses of the sentences refer to American and which to Hungarian viewpoints, but that's just the parlor game for the evening. No, I think that 2024 is the year in which the current political trends became really clear, because until that point, and really until November 5th, there were very strong competing narratives about the last 10 years. And the way that I would frame that is, again, this is the American perspective, I guess, but were the Trump years an exception to the prevailing post-war liberal norm, or were the post-war, post-Cold War liberal years an exception to the normal set of political forces which govern world events? And I think now the answer is pretty clearly that the toolkit, the intellectual toolkit, and the conceptions that were used by people to analyze, to come to the conclusion that the Trump era was an exception, those tools are broken and not adequate to the current political situation. That's part of the reason why the polling was so bad. Maybe polling is not intended to be an objective science. I just want to throw that out there. In fact, all of the nub of this observation, I think, is truer and truer of many Western liberal institutions generally, that they portrayed themselves as objective, science-based, evidence-based, based on clear conceptions that are neutral, that everyone can agree to, and that's manifestly not how they're being used. The problem that the managers of these controls are now facing is that they now have opposite reactions in the world. So they're trying to do the same things, and different things are resulting. So you can see this, I'm picking one out of a hat, in the post-election situation in Georgia, where you have the same playbook, the same liberal NGOs, the same objective polls, pre-election polls, which are then used to claim that the election was stolen or something like that. And it's the same playbook, but the same results, or the good or hoped for results, are not materializing. So this is an exciting situation, but it's a dangerous situation as well, because it means the concepts and the tools to understand the situation and to navigate it from a policy standpoint are not readily available.
So now we know that most Western political experts didn't really understand what's going on in the world. But looking at 2025, connecting everything that happened in 2024 to what we can expect in 2025, what do you see the major disruptions in the last year, or the biggest challenges that will have the biggest impact on the year ahead? Sorry, just to... just to add, so we are gonna start next year with a new U.S. administration. We're gonna have a new European Commission. There are ongoing conflicts, as we heard, in Europe and also in the Middle East. So we have a lot to deal with, and I think we can all agree that it's likely to be a very dangerous year. But what are the main perils that you see in the coming year?
Well, let me sound a note of optimism. I think several things that happen in 2024 that could make 2025 a little bit better. One is, I think, the returning of President Trump to the American presidency. In one respect, could make the world better, because President Trump is manifestly uninterested in military adventurism. I mean, he's not a military adventurer. I think it's true that the claim that he was the first American president since many years who did not start a war on his watch. And I think that hasn't changed from his public speeches, from the views that he has expressed. He is less inclined to embark on military confrontations around the world. So I think that actually, at a high level, reduces the chances for war in the world. Okay, that's number one. Second thing that's, I think, that cause for optimism is 2024 was a year that we really witnessed the rise of the Global South in a material way. And the Global South has become an enormous, self-conscientious, self-aware force in the world, and it's very big and very diverse and very influential. So the enlargement of BRICS, for instance, in 2024, I think would lead to the world being more prosperous and peaceful. And the third is, I think in our neighborhood, in China's neighborhood, 2024 has been a very successful year for China to reach a more peaceful environment in the Western Pacific. So the relationship with ASEAN has improved tremendously. China is now very friendly with Malaysia, Indonesia. In the South China Sea, with all the, with one exception maybe, with all the other claimants in the South China Sea, I think China has improved the relationship with them. It's notably with Vietnam. And there's seems to be a rapprochement with India, which is very promising. So I think in China's immediate surrounding, with one or two exceptions, we're in a much more peaceful environment for 2025.
Yeah, and I think that the danger that I was trying to outline applies less to President Trump himself and more to the existing class of political leaders, particularly here in Europe, unfortunately. But, you know, I'm reminded by your comment of an experience I had at the beginning of the Trump administration. I was sitting in my office in the University of Dallas, and I received a package with a book inside, which had a note from a friend of mine that said, "Here, just wanted you to have my book on what's going to happen." This was 2017 in the upcoming Trump administration. And the book was called World War Trump. And the author is and remains a good friend of mine, and I think that reflected the expectations of a lot of people, that his impulsive, apparently impulsive, or tactical or transactional approach to foreign policy would be more disruptive rather than less. You know, I think that Professor Sachs made a lot of interesting and contestable claims, but when he came to, and I'll leave those aside, but when he came to his expectations for how each of the conflicts that he identified could be solved, there I think that his expectations of the Trump administration are a little bit too low. He almost seemed to be describing, I know he's trying to describe the permanent, or criticize the permanent American foreign policy posture, but I think what we're going to see an attempt at is for America to follow a rational foreign policy for the first time in the recent past. And as much as Professor Sachs might like for the 3 conclusions he recommended to be immediately adopted, it's just not clear to me why anyone entering into a negotiating room would avoid, like, why posit the conclusion that the other side wants rather than going into the negotiating room from a position of strength and to have a negotiation and a trade-off or settlement of some sort. We know Trump. We know he's like that. He's talking about Canada as the 51st state. I mean, this is the guy who will say we should have 1,000% tariffs on Canada until he goes into the negotiating room and comes out with a reasonable solution. Trump doesn't need this like sophisticated post-liberal intellectual framework that, of course, I enjoy trying to describe and put together. He's one of that group of politicians that have a quite close feel on the interests of their nation. And I think that will result, although there are a lot of other forces pressing in the world, that has great potential, even in the relationship with China.
So we can conclude that the foreign policy conducted by the Trump administration will be a rational, a realist one, but and probably he won't be invested in military conflicts too much. But what we see is that, like, he announced like heavy tariffs on Chinese products, and my question is how is China supposed to react to that? Or what are the expectations of China on that? And how should Europe navigate in such a situation?
I think let's put this in a larger context. I think the 2 forces that are shaping our world today are the forces of deglobalization and the force of reglobalization. Okay, so we're at the end of this first round of globalization that's been happening post-Cold War for the last 30 to 40 years. And many countries benefited from that globalization. China, of course, is one of the biggest beneficiaries. And I would say America also is a great beneficiary of this round of globalization. But what's happened is that within the United States, all the benefits of globalization went to very few people. And the vast majority have not benefited as much. So it's leading to a revolt. So the current round of globalization that's ending was led by the United States and the West. And now the primary force of that globalization is retreating from it, is deglobalizing. So that's, I think all that, the tariff talk, the trade war talk was part of this larger picture. But at the same time, China, of course, is the largest trading country in the world and in human history. China's continued development relies on continuing economic interconnectedness with the rest of the world. Okay? So China's attempting a re-globalization, and you see that in Hungary with the automobile manufacturing being put out here, and that's all new. So these 2 forces have their own secular drives, and they are opposed to each other in some ways, but they coexist. So I think tariff and trade war is part of it, but China's, of course, developing new globalizing tools, new globalizing trends around the world as well.
Well, no, I think one main danger that this dialogue can address is that, and this is a little bit what we were talking about beforehand with Eric, is that right now, and it almost sounds like a liberal globalist thing for me to say, but global mutual understanding is at a very low level, particularly after the COVID pandemic. So much so that Americans are not aware, and I think many Europeans are not aware, what happens in China and vice versa. And this affects everyone. Obviously, this is not the only relationship. I'm not trying to say something trite. But after the COVID pandemic, all these exchanges went down. And so when I go back to the US and I run into Tesla drivers. I tell them, I've been driving around in Budapest a lot, and I saw an amazing looking SUV the other day, which I assumed was a Porsche SUV. And I looked a little bit more closely, and it was a BYD SUV. And the point is not that BYD or Tesla is better, but that in order for the US to make good decisions as it faces the principal challenges to it, and China is definitely a challenge to it, there's no point in denying that, it has to have this better mutual understanding, which comes in other conflicts and disputes as well through discussions like this. So I think that there are a lot of things that, when it comes to the U.S. relationship with China, that could be on the table. It's not going to play out the way that Professor Sachs suggested, with the U.S. just making the declaration that he said. For example, is it rational for American military manufacturing to be heavily dependent upon China? No, it's not. I mean, from a basic national sovereignty standpoint, unless there are very good reasons for allowing the components of your key weapons to be made by an adversary or potential competitor, it's irrational. What was it that led to that happening? This is where I'm plugging into, going to echo what you said about different types of globalization. There was in that first period of globalization, the intellectual framework that went with it was the post-Cold War, very excited, very enthusiastic liberalism. Borders won't matter anymore. That's how we'll get rid of disputes. We'll have global culture instead of national culture. That's how we get rid of disputes. That's how we avoid the bugbear of nationalism coming back. And that led to a lot of bad decisions being made. Is it China's fault that the US made a lot of bad decisions after 2001? No, I mean, they were just taking advantage of the situation. But we don't fully have the alternative framework. Hungary has been trying to build it with this concept of connectivity plus the national interest, where it's very highly engaged throughout the world, but also pursuing its national interest. The dream would be if all nations can begin to pursue something like that. There are issues between the United States and China on trade. It's not rational to have key components made elsewhere. So if you were President Trump and you wanted to engage in a negotiation, that's something that's important to you. The other side has some things that are important to it. There will probably be a lot of, blunderbuss beforehand and afterward, and we'll see over the next few years whether a rational solution can come out. But to begin with, we need a new perception on what the entities are, what the countries are, what the building blocks are of a different international framework, and what the underlying forces are that are likely to plug into that. And I think we've made some progress on that today.
I just wanted to add that the car, the BYD, even if it were a Tesla, the chances are it's a Tesla imported from China. Okay. But I absolutely get your point. I mean, I think actually these mistakes go both ways. The Chinese were asleep at the wheel on semiconductor, for instance. I mean, to hand such an incredibly important part, just totally reliant on foreign production, is absolutely crazy, and they're getting their head handed to them right now.
Yeah, and I think there was an interview between Trump and Maria Bartiromo earlier this year in which he was asked about Taiwan, and you could see that his instinct was, okay, well, it's important to the U.S. because of semiconductors and also for geopolitical reasons, but why is American semiconductor manufacturing dependent exclusively on the outside? And so there are clearly alternative models of globalization on offer. No one is going to go back to a totally autarkic standpoint, but the danger is that in the absence of another framework, if we just end up with 4 years or more of tit-for-tat trade wars, well, maybe a couple of issues are solved, but a lot of new problems are created.
We touched a little bit on Europe as well, but I would like to elaborate a bit more on that. How do you see the situation of Europe in the coming years? Because what we see is that Trump seems to be determined in putting an end to the war in Ukraine as soon as possible. He's also advocating for like a biggest strategic autonomy, European strategic autonomy, at least an increased NATO contribution coming from European countries. But at the same time, as we see, the Trump administration will not be lacking a China hoax. The question is, how big of a room for maneuver will Europe have when it comes to dealing with China or dealing with other countries, and how, for example, Hungary's connectivity strategy will be perceived by the incoming administration?
I mean, there are a lot of complex issues there, so I'll just pick one aspect. But I mean, I'm not an investor, and I know I'm in the presence of some investing talent. But investors are always supposed to look at fundamentals, and Europe has a lot of fundamental strengths in the geo-economic world. It is a very large market. It has always been a place that offers something distinct. It's where a lot of raw materials come and are put together with a unique expertise. It has a lot of distinctive features as well. But it has a leverage point. But for its leverage point to function, it has to take a different approach on the international stage. It has to adopt a more peace-building approach to the West and to the East. It has to take care of itself better, and it has to have the fundamental conditions that would allow its economy to flourish, or its economies to flourish. If it can put that recipe together, then it's a wonderful place. It's the place where we're having a conversation now. But again, getting there is a leadership problem. It's a toolbox problem, but there are alternatives to Europe on offer. Hungary is offering one. It's not the only alternative vision, of course, but it's not a doomed area, but it is going to be doomed if it continues to follow its current approach. And I think it's reasonable to adopt a simple historical viewpoint at this point and assert that if Europe becomes a geo-economic black hole, then it will be a catastrophe for the world and for the US and China as well. So hopefully everyone, all the major players will recognize that they too have an interest in a certain vision of a certain type of European strength. That's what I hope for.
I worry about Europe. Let me use the example of Germany. I was in Germany a couple of times this year. I used to worship Germany. Yeah, I go to Germany. The country was always perfect to me. Everything was efficient. Everything was on time. Extremely well designed. But I don't know if you know. I mean, you're close to Germany. Germany is in trouble. The German economy is in trouble across the board, and it's very, very sad and very, very concerning to see. I mean, even the trains are not on time, or actually never on time. It's crazy. It's Germany. The trains are not on time. The planes couldn't take off because they can't load the luggage onto the planes. So I asked what's happening. It turned out that there's been across the board substantial increase in cost in German industry across the board, because of the military problem, military conflicts, okay? So how could a country like Germany do things so against its own interests? How? Who are running Germany? I mean, so if Europe, if that's a reflection of Europe, I mean, if Europe cannot determine its own destiny, if somehow the European leaders cannot make decisions based on the best interests of their peoples, somehow they're following some other agenda. That, I think, is problematic. I mean, we want a better world, to me, is a world in which leaders of different countries, different regions, make decisions based on the best interests of their peoples. It may have conflicts, it may have disagreements, but that's a better world. And I'm not sure if Europe could do that in the future.
Just to end this conversation on a more positive note, hopefully, let's talk a little bit about the Global South. I mean, we've been talking about the Global South all day, and we were also discussing whether we are witnessing an emerging multipolar world or not. Do you think that multipolarity would be a remedy for all the problems that we are witnessing now?
I think the primary contradiction in our world today are between the forces that are trying to construct a multipolar world and the forces who want to preserve a unipolar world. Okay, and these forces, these two forces, we could assign them to different countries or assign them to different forces within the same country. Okay, so there are countries and there are interest groups who derive interest from trying to maintain a unipolar world. Okay, so if you look at America, for instance, I would venture to guess that, I'm not an expert, you tell me if I'm wrong, that Mr. Trump and many of his supporters are actually in favor of a more multipolar world because the unipolar world is not benefiting them. It's benefiting the few people at the top, and it's costing the rest of the country. I like to say the American empire is being maintained at the expense of the American nation. So the costs are tremendous to the people, and that's why they're revolting against it. So I think that's how we want to see the Global South in that context. What we have in common among virtually all the Global South countries is that we'd like to have a multipolar world and a more inclusive world.
Well, it can be hard for Americans to look outside and hard to see what's going on. And so I think it would be a bit too much to ask the incoming Trump administration to say, you know, what we want is a multipolar world, because I think to the average Trump voter, it sounds a little bit weak. They voted for Trump because they want America to be strong again, and that can be the case. It's definitely not going to be the case in the same way that it was in the mid-1990s or in the post-Cold War era before it started to go sideways. But the average American voter, when they think about what sort of world could result from a new relationship with China, they're not thinking about, well, there could be a multipolar world and a Chinese, maybe it's a sphere of influence or something. They're thinking about the spy balloon, which was maybe a weather balloon, but it doesn't matter. They're thinking about the balloon and how awesome it was when we shot it down with a $1 million missile, because more expensive means better. It's very important to think within this framework. So there are some scenarios in which America becomes more of a multipolar player and also feels strong. For example, the Monroe Doctrine. America has always had a natural interest in South America, and that has become much more complicated in the last few years, in part through increasing activity of China in the region, but the US has definitely not played it right. So if it plays its hand better there, well, it could be navigating that well in a multipolar world. Part of the problem is also that the emerging institutions don't look like the old institutions. I think we encountered this at a lot of different points today, and therefore we don't know what to expect. Everyone's always expecting another European Union. Well, if BRICS doesn't become another European Union, is it really a thing? These sorts of questions. That to me is like a secondary or tertiary question. Right now what's happening is that the more that the liberal, universalist, Western institutions pursue their old end, the more they're causing the opposite reaction, as I said at the beginning. So weaponizing the Western financial system ended up creating or prompting the creation of a lot of new types of exchange and settlement mechanisms, which are really just beginning. So this could be good because it could prompt the West to reinvent itself again. It's very good at that. America has clearly proven that it's good at that. People are always asking me if America is about to descend into civil war. Well, I mean, it's such a big country that people move around, everyone becomes happier, and then it manages to reinvent itself again. Seems to be more difficult for Europe to do. But if the West, the US, if Europe can reinvent themselves and become a really positive player in this kind of changing system, then it will be a good result. So that is possible. And if we have more exchanges like the type we had today, where people are laying out their national viewpoint and their perspectives on the existing institutions and their thoughts about the new ones, I mean, if there were 500 platforms like this, then we might actually prompt that change.
I think we've had a fascinating conversation to cap a day which went from sublime to esoteric at the same time in terms of everything we discussed. But look, I think I heard someone say at lunch, speak amongst themselves at lunch, just overheard a conversation, and I truly want to emphasize that the speaker in the morning, I think that was Satu, if I remember, what he said holds true. In the last few years, America has added more economic value to its GDP than Europe and China combined. It is not going anywhere. The story of its demise is greatly exaggerated, and it will continue to be an important partner, actor, collaborator, competitor. And it depends, and all these different characteristics, attributes, are going to be based on how you engage with it. And I think, irrespective of who's in the White House, America has changed in the last 10 years, and I think that's the point Gladden made in his remarks this evening, that it's been a change. There has been a dramatic change in the political culture and the fabric of America. And irrespective of who's in charge, you will be dealing with a very different actor, and that actor is not going away. It will remain the most eminent global actor for a while. So get used to dealing with a different America and start building your strategies. Number two, don't let the Europeans fool you. They are stronger than they let you know. Just because they are self-effacing and they like to browbeat themselves and they like to question their own place in the world and their capabilities, I'm telling you, it's a tactic. That's how they colonized us. Don't let them fool you. They are clever. They are at the heart of the world, and they are not going away. They will build partnerships. They will build the relationships. They will build the channels of future growth and of future prosperity. And I am betting on Europe. That's why I'm here. Europe is the future, and certainly it is going to be a part of anyone's calculus in the days ahead. Now, we can complain about how they govern themselves, but let me tell you something. Europe has one attribute that very few other countries have. Mine does, the Americans do, and that's democracy. Democracy allows them to reinvent themselves, to correct themselves, and to rejuvenate themselves. And very few countries in the world can say that, including the two most important countries outside of Europe and America, which are China and Russia, which don't have this luxury. So while Europe may have an empire of norms, their democracy will moderate it. The American empire will be moderated by the American nation, as someone was mentioning today. Very few other large powers have this capacity to self-correct. And I think that's something, and that's why you should continue to bet in Europe. If Europe was a stock, buy it now. You're getting it at the low rate. Okay? So that's the second point I wanted to make. Third, we heard through the day about the deployment of national interest as a principle of international engagement. Right? We heard that. We heard that, that's a good way of doing it. We heard this in this panel. I spoke about it earlier in the day, and I was thinking about it. If America wants to right-size its engagement with China, that is also national interest. If the Chinese want to change the relationship with certain countries in the world, that is also national interest. And in some sense, big countries can exert national interest. Small countries have to be protected from the perversions of national interest. So global governance is not about allowing big countries to do what they want to do. They have always done it. It's about ring fencing the interest of the smaller ones. And that is why we talk about global governance. And if we are honest about what we are seeking to do without making it an endowment from God, the message that we are carrying for others, and if we are real about what we are seeking to do, that we want to prevent excesses of China, excesses of America, excesses of large countries, my country included in the future, I think that would be a great conversation to have. But it is not a message from God that you're carrying, and it is not a holy grail of human existence. It has to be real, and I think the Trump White House and the recent elections in Europe tell us that global politics is getting real. And in some sense, you may call it transactional, I call it real. And I think the word is that we are more real today than we ever were. Finally, we spoke about multipolarity, and I think that's a question that Leela engaged on. This is really interesting. All of us love unilateralism, and all of us talk multipolarity. It's true. The Americans created the Monroe Doctrine, and they have pursued that across the world now, because the world is their neighborhood, so they don't want any competitor anywhere in the world. Earlier it was their backyard, and now since the world is their backyard, they don't want any competitor anywhere. That's American exceptionalism. The Chinese want a multipolar world, but a unipolar Asia, because it suits their purpose, that when if it comes to their sphere of influence, they want to exert their power and their writ over a certain neighborhood. So is the case of smaller regional groupings, regional powers in different parts of the world. This is politics 101, and it's not something that's been born because Trump was re-elected or because Europe has a different set of leaders. Countries have exerted influence when they can, where they can, and have done it brutally at times. And that is something, again, that we must prevent from happening if we are looking at a global collective that moderates the edges and creates an order. And I think that's something we really need to think about. Multipolarity is not new. Multilateralism is also not new. And all we are now witnessing is a new chapter, new avatar, new iteration that requires new authors and new guardians of that order. So I'm betting on Europe. I'm betting on this evening that we're going to have now. And thank you so much for your diverse thoughts, for competing thoughts, for divergent thoughts, for some. And the European panel nearly got into fisticuffs. I like that. I mean, I was going to get up and I was going to play the referee there. That, guys, you are good people, don't fight. But thank you for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for sharing your energy, and thank you for sharing your passion. But please join me in thanking Gladden, Leela, and the entire team at the Hungarian Institute for being such wonderful hosts and for putting this all together. So please join me in thanking them and my team who has worked with them. So thank you very much. Let's enjoy the evening. Thank you.